Welcome, people, to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Low Key, here on Mint Press. As you know, on a weekly basis, we are going against the grain, covering stories and covering perspectives which are regularly marginalized by the mainstream media. Because of that, we do need your support. So I would invite anybody watching us right now live on YouTube to please like, share, subscribe, comment on this video, but also support us on Patreon so we can continue doing this brilliant investigative journalism that you see from Mint Press week in, week out. Now, today we know that the whole world has its eyes on Uvalde, Texas, where we have seen 19 children and 2 adults killed at Robb Elementary School when 18-year-old Salvador Ramos entered the school armed with different assault weapons and killed these children and 2 of their teachers. Eventually, we saw him shot and killed, but there have been serious allegations of parents present that armed police not only for over 45 minutes prevented them being able to help their children, but even there are allegations that police handcuffed, tasered, and pepper sprayed parents at the scene. There are even reports that some police present entered the school to take their own children out of harm's way, but did not allow other parents to do the same. We were, of course, reeling off the back of the attack in Buffalo on the 14th of May, which saw a gunman kill 10 black people inside a supermarket. Peyton Gendron was charged and is still in prison without bail. It's also just come to light that one of the 6 people that Peyton gave some type of warning to that he would carry this out. Among those 6 people was a retired FBI agent. 30 minutes before the attack took place, it is believed he sent a message out to these 6 people that he was in communication with. Now, when talking about something like this, there are few voices that can give us as in-depth a historical context in which this is taking place, can give us that perspective as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, a historian, writer, and activist who very kindly and generously is with us now. Roxanne, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing fine. I'm still, of course, mourning these horrible situations. Within 10 days, it makes me angry and sad at the same time.
Horrific indeed. Now, to start with, just to ask, you recently stated that the Democrats worship the Constitution and believe that it is a democratic document that supports a vision for a racially just society. As is known, the Monrovia program that Thomas Jefferson and others put forth following the War of Independence of the 13 colonies, Jefferson, not long after it, a lot of the people in bondage had been promised manumission and emancipation if they fought alongside either the British side or the side of the 13 colonies. Now, Jefferson, after it, wrote that absorbing free people into the society would risk 2 things, either bloodletting or blood mixing. And these, according to Jefferson, despite the well-documented relationship with Sally Hemings and the children that came from that, this was something that Jefferson wanted to avoid. So in tandem with the American Colonization Society, they set up Monrovia in Liberia, which was the supposed returning home of people that for several generations had been in bondage of in what would become the United States. And you very much couch your analysis of these events, these horrific events, which, as you correctly point out, are a minority of deaths from guns that take place in the United States, but you couch them within the genocidal foundations of the United States of America. Could you just explain to us that that critical analysis of the U.S. Constitution and how that fits into events that we may have seen?
Yes, the Constitution, most countries, not all countries have constitutions, but the ones who do, they generally renew them, not the method to change the U.S. Constitution is almost impossible. And they don't consider that it's sacred. I think France has had 5 constitutions, a whole new generation, a whole new nation, new people. Let's change the Constitution, do a new one. And the U.S. Constitution, like many things about the U.S., is unique. A settler colonial state that became the most powerful military and economic state in human history. That's pretty exceptional. And that Constitution is so embedded in white supremacy that there's no way to amend it, to change that, because it's everywhere. And of course, I've focused on the Second Amendment, which is one of the Bill of Rights, individual rights that were added to the Constitution after it was ratified. So the Bill of Rights is a private, personal rights, and the right to free speech, of course, is known. But the second one, and the second most important to people, is the Second Amendment, which does give individual rights to white settlers to form well-regulated, self-regulated militias to kill Indians and take their land. And these are later adopted as well, or extended to slave patrols in the 1680s. And this is so obvious if you just face what U.S. history is and not leave so much out, which U.S. historians tend to do, omission. But many of them simply lie, make up things, a whole different version of the United States. The Constitution is a democratic, it's for everyone. First of all, it's not democratic, even for white people in the beginning. You had to own property, and that property could be slaves, of course. And so that, Andrew Jackson extended it to, basically he had people take more land so they could, everyone could have land and property and be citizens. But this, and of course we see it in immigration too, the exclusion of people of color or horrible mistreatment. The Chinese in particular, Asians in general, erasure of the native people. So all of these things add up, but the Second Amendment is what allows this proliferation of guns that we have. The white settler state was fully intact at the end of World War II. Jim Crow segregation was solid, not only in the South, but in northern cities where African Americans had fled to, slightly less onerous, and they could have jobs, but still segregated schools. The Chinese were totally, Asians totally suppressed, many of them undocumented, Mexicans undocumented, Native Americans locked down on reservations, dependent on rations after the 100 Years' War to take the continent. And that was 1948. That was it. And yet there were these colonial, national liberation movements stirring and increasing, and this great fear and this competition with the Soviet Union, which was supporting national liberation movements. And of course, China, the largest population in the world, had a revolution right at that time that was communist. And so there's, a good part of the world was socialist, communist, national liberation. So the United States had to figure out, it came out of the war as the only, one of the few places that absolutely had no fighting going on at all, and came in late, so that was really the Soviet Union, the Red Army that mainly ended the Nazi regime. So they started, and they even have open discussions in Congress about, for instance, the Genocide Convention of 1948. They didn't ratify it. Truman signed it into law, but that's not law until the Senate passes it. So it was 1988 before the Senate. So they had 40 years to fix things in place, so they couldn't be. And they openly talked about that. If we ratify this, that means, the Black people, in fact, a group of Black people marched on Washington, on Congress, with a document called "We Charge Genocide," and so that was in 1950, I think. So it was very clear. Yes, it's genocide, and of course, Native American organizations were also. This was a document made for groups. It's the only only single international law that protects minority groups, groups that aren't in power, and names of ethnic, political groups. And a powerful document is one that Native Americans depend on very strongly in their work at the United Nations. And so that fear, and then, the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 that desegregated public schools. This was like a shock to every white, especially in the South. The Southern states actually controlled, really, they were Democrats then. Their control of Congress, and the presidency at the time. That this was really a shock that the Supreme Court did this, and they could see the writing on the wall. If these children grow up having Black friends, the whole white children having Black friends, they will be lost, to the white nationalist point of view. Even if their parents are racist, everyone knows, kids have their own instincts, and if they're exposed to something, they're influenced by it. And kids love each other. They don't look at each other's color or anything else. They just love to play together. And so that's when, these citizens committees formed in many states and they linked up communism and integration together. And so a lot of the anti-communism you see that's called anti-communism, you just lift a little curtain, and underneath that is actually white supremacy, what they're afraid of. They called Martin Luther King a communist, the civil rights movement filled with communists. So this was this right wing that we see almost totally in power at the national level and in half the states today, that's where they had their beginning. And they have worked tirelessly to stack the Supreme Court, to make sure it's almost impossible to amend the Constitution. But, international law treaties become a part of the Constitution once they're ratified. And so the Genocide Convention is part of the Constitution. And our lawyers, even progressive ones, don't really use it that much because they're not trained in international law. Or if they are, it relates to other people's human rights abuses, not the U.S. So that's that's kind of the setting, and nothing was ever really made of the Second Amendment because all white people were already armed, and they restricted guns, from slaves, and then black people too, and black people got their shotguns and all to protect themselves, but Native Americans weren't allowed to have guns. It was actually a crime to sell guns to Native Americans. And so the guns were in white people's hands, and they existed. There were a lot of them. There's always been this gun fetish, the United States being such a violent and militaristic place, and settler colonialism. So it was like an axe. They often say that, gun nuts often say that now. Well, it's just like an axe or a hoe, and it is to them. Only, it's deadly. So it wasn't until the mid-1970s that the National Rifle Association got taken over by a white nationalist group called the Second Amendment Foundation. A former border guard, Harlan Carter, he had been a member of the NRA, but he formed that organization for the purpose of, with others, for the purpose of taking over the NRA, which was a kind of benign hunting and fishing thing. It was kind of gun fetish, but it was a fetish about hunting as a tradition, boys getting guns, their BB guns, and then their guns when they're 13 years old. But it was fairly benign. No laws were, there were no restrictions on guns until the 1930s. There were no laws either way. Guns were taken for granted. In the 1930s, when the gangs in Chicago and Baltimore and the ethnic gangs, the Italian, Irish mafias, and TMIT, the Treasury Department, which is in charge of guns, pushed to get to ban the Tommy gun, the first repeating rifle. And the NRA testified in favor of it. So that's the only law that ever even existed. And so they start working under Harlan Carter and his group. They pretty well push out the others become kind of benign. They still do the hunting, fishing part of it, but they start building really a gun culture. And that is the beginning of what we see, the proliferation of guns. And of course, the gun industry, which is one of the few manufacturing industrial corporations that didn't go offshore, move offshore for lower wages. And it's a domestic, giant. And you can imagine how much money they make with small arms, and also export. Half the small arms in the world are exported by the United States. So we own, in the United States, with 5% of the world's population, we own half the guns in the world. That's just stunning, So that's sort of the whole, platform, which we can then, talk about these mass shootings, these just proliferation of guns. This kid turned 18 years old, just like the one also in Buffalo. I think it may have been copycat because it looked, without the white nationalist stuff of the Buffalo guy, just, oh, yeah, well, I'm turning 18. I can go buy guns. And I think he imitated the Buffalo shooter by doing that and buying two legally in a, of course, he didn't have any, the background check. He didn't exist. How could he, have the background check does nothing for someone who hasn't committed a crime. So that's, that people think, well, I have this right. I didn't know I had. And why not have it, And then, of course, the kid is angry. He's been bullied. And at 18 years old, your brain is not even completely formed, and certainly not emotionally. So it's, and I think even, soldiers who are recruited at that age and often younger is the same thing. They're very malleable and, it really screws them up for life, most of them. So, yeah, so that's kind of the platform that you need to really then, within which to put these mass shootings.
And one thing I'm interested in, Roxanne, you point out this sort of trajectory from the first colony, Virginia, it being forbidden for any man to travel unless they were armed. Eventually it becomes sort of a legal obligation to be armed within churches, to then in Massachusetts it being, an order that every single man, and by that, that means white men, having to carry weapons everywhere in public. You trace that trajectory from then to now of this sort of way in which the Second Amendment is viewed as sacred, but its roots within genocidal settler colonial society. But then you also make the point that you look at the example of Canada and Australia, Tasmania, the entire indigenous population were completely wiped out, not just through diseases, but through hunting, being literally hunted by British imperialists. In Australia until 1967, legally, as far as I understand, indigenous people were defined as fauna and flora, which is plants and animals and plants. Now, what you ask, and this is a question I wanted to put to you, is why is it that these societies with genocidal roots, these settler colonial societies, have not produced this same situation of mass shootings repeating again and again? What's the difference between the United States and these other societies?
Yeah, it's something I see every day in the mainstream press, that editorials, op-ed pieces, even articles that go over this, the Australia doing away with all their guns, and everyone participated after that horrible mass shooting in Tasmania. I think over 50 people were killed, and it was so horrifying but they didn't have any kind of constitutional obstruction to it, or a Supreme Court that said you can't do that because the Second Amendment, you have the right to bear arms, and you have to take the bad with the good with a right, just like free speech. You say nasty things, but it's free speech and can't be suppressed. So that is true of the rest of the world. This is the only country that has such a right, a constitutional engraved right of, and as you say, in the colonial period, actually having to train settlers by forcing them, making it, because they're always moving, pushing the native people. And the other thing is this, the mythology about who native people were, that they were just kind of roaming around in the jungle, or in the forest. barefoot and with their bow and arrow, and or fighting wars with each other. All the mythologies that are still pretty much there. When it comes to and liberals see as well this, how sad it is that so many died of infectious diseases brought by the Europeans, so that the Spanish presence for a century before the Anglos came, that everyone had kind of died off. They were just scattered groups. That's not true. They were densely populated. They were farmers. 99% of indigenous people in the Americas were farmers before the Europeans came. Almost all the foods in the world that we eat, vegetables, were invented. Corn, potatoes, squash, invented by, they don't even know the origin of the corn seed. The seed has never been found. And of course, most indigenous people of the Americas, that's the most sacred thing. They were one of the 7 founding agrarian civilizations of the world by, scientists. They're listed. The eastern part of North America, the whole eastern part from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, Mesoamerica, and the Incas, the Andes, were 3 of the 7. So because why would you have all these laws for these people to be armed? It's not like they're in some place, even lions or bears are going to attack them, or you would just need maybe one gun, in the group. But if they went out into the fields, there was this law they had to be ready and trained in their self-organized militias to quickly be able. Well, what are they afraid of? They're on stolen land, recently stolen. And on the periphery are those people who are trying to get their land back, the indigenous people. And so I don't know what the logic of most U.S. people, when I present this, from after my book on Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, where I lay all this out, 2014, I've spoken a lot, and people were very sympathetic already, very sympathetic to Native issues, are just stunned that they don't put these things together. There's so many pieces left out of U.S. history that it's very hard to assemble. And also just understanding what settler colonialism is. I think, it's very funny because those of us who study settler colonialism in the Anglo-settler colonialism, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, we never really got any traction with it until Palestinians identified what has happened to them as settler colonialism. We look, hey, that's it. So I always say, well, Palestine, groups I'm talking to. Well, that's what it is here. In fact, the Israelis, the Zionists, took the model. Mahmoud Mandami has that in his book, Neither Settler or Citizen. That's really an important book. It has Palestine, the United States, and South Africa, case studies of settler colonialism. So that is something just very foreign to most U.S. people. And Native scholars have worked very, very hard, for the last 20 years or so, of creating an incredible archive of literature. For one thing, articles and books and essays in poetry and in novels and in history, nonfiction books. But it's such a small percentage of the output, and the population is small, that there have to be a lot of allies who understand this, and all the other issues of the United States can open up people's minds once they understand settler colonialism and once they understand the theft of land for agribusiness, slave worked agribusiness. Then a lot of things can start falling in place. But that I think that erasure of Native Americans makes it very difficult to put those things together. How we have this gun culture, everyone being required to have guns, to form militias, to control, because there's no way the government and the army can control, all these people who live in all these villages. It takes these settlers, not all of them when they arrive understand that this is their fate, but they have to, if they're going to stay, it's hard to get a ride back. And of course, in Australia, they dumped prisoners. I mean, sometimes people just pick pockets, not. They're always portrayed as convicts, but at England, you're a convict if you steal a penny or a loaf of bread. It doesn't take killing someone. So they were forced settler colonial.
Or even the Tolpuddle Martyrs, for example, the first trade union that formed in Britain when they were sent away for punishment to a penal colony. It was in Australia. So
I know they have great unions now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so that I think is essential to understanding the gun culture. Was partly, the way it is now was partly ideologically created. And I think that came from the white backlash to desegregation and the civil rights movement, which made great gains. This was almost invisible in the 1960s, that we weren't going to win. I was an activist then. I was certain that we were changing the world, that we had this, and unfortunately, too many of my comrades had this thing of they really did, that one of the ways it would happen is that white people would become a minority and would not have power. That's an erroneous thing, because minorities have held power in human history a lot, more than not, some kind of minority. And in the U.S., it's always just been the rich people. It's been the white people who have the power. And so anyone who comes in, let's say Black people are hired, and, Native Americans or Mexicans, there's still the infrastructure and the whole structure. They have to fit in. They have to become white, or try to become white as much as they can. So they still are not in really they have to stay. I mean, some of us were rebelling against it, but the majority, you have to have a job, and you have to be within that capitalist, a capitalist country. You have to work in order to live, and you have to just fit into what already exists. So all the immigrants who come, are processed into pursuing whiteness as to be integrated, to be an American. They call it being American, but that means, I my last book was on immigration, this idea of nation of immigrants, and it was really, I intended to write it as a plea to immigrants, especially immigrants of color, or children of immigrants of color, to be aware that it is their fate, unless they act and be woke, that they will become Americanized, and they will take the settler attitude and to guard against it because it's toxic. It makes them Americans. So that's, the people of color have a very hard time with, and so there's been rebellion, but it's not lack of trying to fit in, because you have to survive. Your kids have to survive. You have to keep a job. So there's a lot of pressure to become an American. So yeah, they're only, the numbers are lower, but I think they've made exceptions for who can be white. Like the head of the Proud Boys is a African American presenting Cuban of an immigrant family, and that is, but he's accepted because he's a fascist. So.
One of the points that you make that impedes our ability to respond to these things. Now, you have seen 7 decades of life. You compare the 60s, where you say the building of grassroots movements, in comparison to what happened, where sort of you replace social justice with philanthropy.
Yeah.
And in comes the sort of professionalization of activism, in comes the NGOization of these things. Could you just expand on that for us, please, when looking at across, the last 4 to 5 decades, really?
Yeah, it was painful to watch or to experience, having been, I called myself a revolutionary, as many of us did in the 60s, and we were everywhere, at every level. Some were underground, and of course in the 70s and 80s, and we had, we thought we had masses, and I think we weren't understanding that the masses mainly came from the anti-war movement. I mean, of course, civil rights had masses, but they're a minority group. They're a small percentage of the population. But the masses that of all kinds of people, and of course, many, many white young people, the whole SDS and other organizations are very militant, and the women's movement, the white women's movement, was very, very militant. These things were so big, but the core of it in numbers was really against the war. And when I think it was a shock to many of us, it was so one day and the next, almost seemingly, we went from these massive protests where people get politicized in those situations. So you grow your more, groups of people who are actually analyzing things. And if you don't have that mass movement to recruit from, it's very, very hard. So it's probably impossible. So we see them going away, just you look around, and I remember Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda were still doing, after 73 when the peace agreement in Paris, but they just took out ground troops. They didn't take out the air power. So it was really 75 when the loss, when, they were trying to simply close it down, and it was a lost war. But in that time, they were still among the few who were going around the country, all over, and talking and going back and forth and visiting Vietnam, and they had a big effect. But I remember toward the end, right after the conclusion, they wanted to continue about U.S. militarism in other places, that was taking place. Their interventions in Africa, the interventions and the killing of Lumumba and all these things. And you would see before you would see these masses of people, because of partly the celebrity, Jane Fonda was very willing to attract crowds. And then she's very smart. I mean, her politics were excellent. And seeing just, a handful of people. And I remember the American Indian movement that I got involved in. It was similar. I mean, it was a big thing. Wounded Knee really also brought in new people who knew nothing about, Native people. And it lasted long enough, almost 2 months, to really gain attention and huge support. And then by the next year, they're killing and arresting AIM people, and there's just this floating away, of all these support groups. I mean, they still existed, but the numbers. So that's when I think the philanthropists moved in, and the philanthropists were very important to these movements, but it was without any kind of strings. You have nothing to say to us. They begged to give people money. I know. I said I don't trust, taking money from people. I come from a very poor background, and that to me is dangerous. Taking money from, what do I know? What are they going to, do? And I was very suspicious, but on the take some, just cautious. But most people, middle class people, it just. And these philanthropists were mostly activists themselves. And then when there was little activity in the 1980s, I don't think they had evil intentions necessarily, but suddenly they were in charge and calling the shots, helping form groups. And you can't do that top down. It really is astroturf, which they always say about the right wing. The right wing has a big mass base, actually. NRA has chapters in every county in the United States, and they're all grassroots. They don't take orders from headquarters, are not funded. They're voluntary groups, grassroots groups. And we have nothing like that now. And then people started working, and then a new generation just thought, that's one career opportunity, to be paid to organize. That was a foreign idea to us from the 60s. None of us were paid to do anything. We lived on peanut butter sandwiches. There was just, that all just evaporated. And the Reagan era, of course, was very oppressive, and it was we were defeated, and there was that. People wouldn't really admit it. A lot won't admit it now. Well, there was this and that. We were defeated. We didn't win that war, and but there was that. People who stayed engaged, working, never quit, they're organizing, asked for money for it. There was still this lack of energy, lack of enough people, and not being able to. But the United States is, very experienced in buying people off and offering other things, like college scholarships, affirmative action. Now we've gotten to the point where a lot of really good people have come out of, the Ivy Leagues and Stanford and these places, people of color, who are activists. But I would say there are few, but most go into corporate law or politics or business or whatever, to make money, because they have those opportunities. They don't have to fight for them. They get recruited while they're there. So the kind of people who in the 60s would have continued their education, but their hearts were in the movement.
And another thing I'm quite interested in is Yasha Levine. Yasha Levine, in his book Surveillance Valley, his assertion is that post the Vietnam defeat, the US military set about designing the ARPANET, which was the basic system of what would then become the World Wide Web, the internet, and that there was some belief within the US military that a system like this would be very useful for the prediction of unrest and for insurgency
Yeah.
purposes. Now, you've also got a great book by Stephen Carr, if I remember correctly, his first name, The Shallows, which looks at the long-term effect on cognitive development in the use of the internet on a daily basis. Now, you, of course, many of the people watching this, the way that they have sort of participated politically in the world has been in this sort of high-tech goldfish bowl, whereby everything about what we do is being used to create character points, which are on one hand used to advertise to us more effectively, but on the other hand, no doubt used for surveillance purposes. How did political involvement change from the time of the internet to before the internet existed? What would you say is a major difference for you that you may have observed?
Well, of course, when the internet came in, I was older and formed, so I've never I've always treated it with suspicion in terms of a kind of addiction, because there is that feeling that, especially after social media, the Facebook and they proliferate, Twitter and then TikTok and all of them. You can go down this rabbit hole. You start looking, and then you go here, and then you go there, and you look up, and like 6 hours have passed, and only because you maybe have hunger pains. Well, oh my God, I missed this appointment or something. And when that happened to me a couple of times, the first time it happened to me was 2008, when it was 2009, but my brother was dying of cancer in Oklahoma. I'm from Oklahoma. And I went to be with him, in his last days, and he mostly was sleeping. And I didn't have a laptop at the time, but he had a computer, and I signed up for Facebook, and I got really, really deeply involved. And it was pretty primitive at first, it was not as many people or anything. I get in these huge arguments, and it would just go on and on and on and on. And it kept me from being very depressed and sad. It kept me, I think it was okay, but then it also scared me. I said, this is something I have to be careful with. So I always have. I very purposely don't. I do have Facebook and Twitter. It's good. The people I have our books that we publish and discuss. If you can be disciplined, but mostly really young people who come to it want to socialize on it. It's a social, and I don't social. I mean, most people my age don't socialize on, or maybe they, have a group of some kind, a book reading group or something. And it's kind of social, but it's not, obsessively, and how you look and how you talk and how many likes you get and everything, and suicide happening with young people that feel, they're not making it. It's just ramps up a whole lot of social problems, maybe to a degree that is, I'm not sure if I actually met some of the people at Los Alamos who had been involved in the military invention of the internet. I never got the idea from them. Of course, would probably given orders that there was any plan as such. So I'm not sure we can see that. They may now, later seen, wow, this is something we can really use. And of course they do. And with that post 9/11 war on terror, their surveillance mechanism ramped up like I don't think any of us even understand that everything is known about us now. Everything. I've forgotten about privacy. Forget it. You drive yourself crazy. There's no such thing unless you close the door and never do anything. So that's, and I'm sure that's spread around the world, but I think it's most powerful here. I can't imagine any other country has that kind of surveillance technology that the U.S. had already, had the grounds for, but just had no congressional interference, no oversight, just go for it. And that was, of course, revealed by the young man, what's his name, who's now in exile in Moscow.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden. That's what he revealed to us. And that was a long time. I mean, that was quite a while ago. It must be much, much worse now. And of course, WikiLeaks has, and they've both been criminalized. So not many other people are doing these things, revealing what's happening.
So, Roxanne, in your experience and your life of writing, of activism, of struggling, of fighting back, of pushing forward, what would you say is the greatest and most enduring lesson from the human experience that you have drawn?
It's, I have always used that Gramscian phrase of optimism of the spirit and, pessimism of the mind. And then I remember the Cubans had a saying that un comunista tiene que ser optimista. To be a communist, you have to be an optimist. I think that was something Che said. So that was very, it was kind of a decision. You have to be an optimist because otherwise you're useless. You have to. When I see a pregnant woman or a baby or a child, I think these are optimistic people. They think there's a future. It actually makes me feel better these days. That's getting to the basics of kind of maintaining optimism about humanity. I feel so grateful that I have, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, Marxian thought and structure that make me able to understand what's going on. But I think most people don't have that kind of possibility. I mean, just to know it is at least to give you some sense to be realistic what's going on, and not hide it from yourself, not to be Pollyannish. Oh, everything's going to be okay because there's such good people in the world. We'll get gun control because 70% of the people want gun control. No, it's not how it works, But you don't then just get depressed. You say, well, this is how we have to strategize and all, to make a difference. But it's pretty overwhelming, I think, in the last 10 years, not just since Trump, but in the last 10 years, it came with Obama, that white nationalist backlash of the Tea Party people. And I come from rural Oklahoma, so I'm very familiar with the people, that formed the Tea Party and white nationalists. Some are my relatives, actually. And they've been suppressed by the power of civil rights and human rights and women's rights. And when they saw, a black president, this was too much, I think. And all of those strings, of course, there were people doing it and people funding it. The Koch brothers, really got involved in funding the Tea Party, and then, the white nationalists, and then January 6th, and where they really, really revealed themselves. I think that's the main thing to come out of that. It's not insurrection, but there was performance, a warning. It wasn't an insurrection as such. But that, I think me and, my comrades I'm closest to, it's very hard to see a future, especially with climate catastrophe. And I think we have to do something. We can't just sit aside. So I just think the only thing in history that has ever made changes is masses of people in the street, and not expecting to get publicity for it. Probably no one knows that this March for Our Lives, these students, survivors at Parkland, organized in the last 2 days of organized demonstrations from high schools, walkouts all over this country. I haven't seen a single thing in the press about that, not even the left press, The Nation or anything, because that's not, they don't care about that. They care about changing people, but we need to know about it that's going on, and we need to do that, all of us, in any way we can.
I mean, the interesting crossover there that you mentioned with the Koch brothers funding particular right-wing movements is here in the UK. Money was put into a right-wing Islamophobe creature of the war on terror, Tommy Robinson, through the Donors Capital Fund, which was a funnel for the Koch brothers. But then what you also saw in addition to one of the points you just made is when students here took part in a massive walkout on the issue of climate change, you saw the Extinction Rebellion emblem included on an intelligence document within schools. You have something called Prevent, which is basically quite a totalitarian thought police way in this country, in which children as young as 3 can be questioned by counter-terror police without the knowledge of their parents, or even their parents being informed. That's a statutory duty in all public sector institutions in this country. So the emblem of Extinction Rebellion at the same time that walkout took place was included on one of these documents to say that if children are seen in schools to identify with Extinction Rebellion or these ideas, then they should be subject to this kind of surveillance. Roxanne, it's been so amazing to talk to you. I really have appreciated your insight and wisdom, and I hope that long may we benefit from your perspectives and from the depth of your historical knowledge. I think it's also important for us to remember that just yesterday, this horrifying footage came out from Brazil, where we saw 2 police officers take a man into a car and sort of create this improvised gas chamber in which he was killed. The footage is all over the internet. It's well known what kind of violence the Brazilian police, in a really aimed way against class violence, takes place on a daily basis in Brazil. It's really very much a sort of feature of the Brazilian state. As you can see, Manar is showing that horrific footage there. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone for joining us for this episode of the Watchdog. I would encourage everybody to purchase and read and appreciate Roxanne Dunbar Ortez books, and it will be great to have you on again at some point
Yes.
on the Watchdog.
Let's do
Thank
it
you very
again.
much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you for
much.
joining.
Thank everyone who's with us.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.